sliders and such. There we go. Okay, slide overcompensation there for volume. But we are operational. And make sure that I'm checking some of my little live dashboards and things to make sure that everything is not all weird. And that's fine. So for those of you who watched the show last week, Sai helped to get me past the panic mode of the fact that YouTube has improved their way to make it harder to do YouTubes. And so that was a really clumsy visual experience of still pictures and yeah. Bleh. Anyway, now we're kind of sort of back into the normal worlds of things. And again, I cannot possibly thank Sai enough for all of this, because this is just yet more panic that I don't have to worry about. Anyway, for those of you who have been following me the last many weeks, this has been an analysis of Contested Bones, where creationists Rupe and Sanford attempt to show that human evolution is just a pile of dingo's kidneys. And unfortunately, it's actually an opportunity to analyze the source methods of how particular creationists assemble their arguments, and how they manage to deck stack, and how they manage to avoid data field. Well, we're now into a part where they are going after the radiometric dating thing. And needless to say, since both of the authors of the book are young Earth creationists, have been reluctant to actually blurt that out, it's kind of becoming quite clear as they hit this section, because they're trying to show that argon dating is wrong, and they date volcanoes to be way older than they actually are. Yeah, it's more complicated than that. And what's fun is to see how all the sources they're trotting out probably siphoned mainly from creationists. There's a Steve Austin posting that I put up, and also one from Andrew Snelling. That's likely where Rupe and Sanford were trawling their material. And both of these, by the way, were from the 1990s. Well, it isn't 1998 anymore. It's 2017 when they're doing their book, and it's 2019 now. Can't we be a little more up to date? Well, that's where we start looking at the little fiddly bits part. There was an article I put up that they cited by Broadhurst that was just on how argon is soluble in a lot of crystals in magmatic contexts. None of which refutes radiometric dating. It just means that's another variable you have to take into consideration, that argon, which can leach out, can also be retained in certain contexts, at least for a while. And that's the whole point, is that it doesn't mean it's going to stay there indefinitely, because it depends on the kind of crystal formations. So you'd have to then look to see how they're dealing with, the scientists are reacting to this material versus how Rupe and Sanford covered the subject. And what they did is draw upon this old material. One of which I put up is a reference to Mount Erebus in Antarctica, where according to a chart in their book, that eruption from 1984 AD was dated at 640,000 years old. Ha ha, ba-bam. Well, that one turned out to be handy, because it related to a specific scientist that they didn't specifically list which reference referred to what, but it actually had this material from Esser from 1997 that was on argon in melting inclusions. And what they were finding out in that paper they cited was that chlorine in the magma was affecting the amount of argon that was being temporarily retained. And so what you have are two actual variables going on. One is whether or not argon can naturally bubble out. It's a gas, remember, and it doesn't form, it's an inert gas. It doesn't link up with anything. So it just doesn't want to connect up and get trapped that way. Eventually it's going to bubble out. If it's underwater, it turned out that it's much harder to do that. So that had to be taken into account. The other issue is argon that's being produced by the radioactive decay, that old bits of magma can have that in it, and it can get incorporated into newer magma. So that made it more complications. Well, over the last decades, they've figured all of that out. So I put a linkage up to a more recent paper by Esser's bunch on that very same volcanic system, where they worked out the sequencing of when it has erupted and worked out all that stuff using these radiometric dating techniques and other techniques, because the crystals are different depending upon the temperatures they're forming at, and the crystals vary depending upon whether or not argon has been retained or not, and all that stuff. So guess how much of that information was being presented in the argument in the Rupe and Sanford's book? Nope. They just leave that out. Snelling's piece, in fact, directly mentions that chlorine matter, but not much. So even though he was aware of the fact that there were all these little dynamic characteristics that you have to take into account, but you can take them into account, it doesn't mean you junk radiometric dating. Snelling doesn't really go that far, and therefore Rupe and Sanford don't go that far. So let's take a look at who are in the live chat in here. So hopefully our visuals and all the rest are much better than before. Benjamin Simpson said, good morning all from Brisbane, Australia. Yes, hello, Benjamin. And we got Heat Shield, we got Nana, and of course the delightful Cy Strike, who has been helping me all of this. And it's critical to Rupe and Sanford's argument that they have to undermine the radiometric dating, because if they have to fill a time sequence of millions of years between the very first Australopithecines and early tool making, and then more advanced Australopithecines and very early Homo genus, and yet more sophisticated tools, and yet the humans spreading out more and more and more our genus, and then way down the road, we eventually get into Homo sapiens in Africa, and more waves and spreads of things and improving tools and starting to do things of painting the faces and burying and all these other factors that are coming in, not all at once, and the shifting anatomy and brain systems and all of that. If they have to try to fit that into a narrative that involves millions of years to see what's going on and interpolate what they think is happening in between, it's going to be a mess to try to account for it in anything that's going to relate to the creationist model. So can they do that by compacting everything down? Well, if you leave out most of the data, yeah. And we'd already seen in earlier chapters how diligent they were in flushing data field down the drain, misrepresenting what the animals look like, cherry picking quotations. I've been generating a spreadsheet, whereas I do in my own work, analyzing what sources they're drawing on and how they're being categorized. And it turns out that there's less than half of their reference base. They've only got some 400 sources, which is averaging at 1.6 per page, which is really low compared to the like 5 or 6, 7 that you get into when you get into serious work. And of the technical citations they were citing, most of them aren't technical citations. But of them, those that are, about half of them are being misrepresented in that way. That's not very good. So they're parsing the data field down to cram into a time frame, and then not really working out whether that time frame even makes sense. Because remember, if they're going with a young Earth creationist chronology, all of these fossils are at the same time as the Egyptians and Noah, supposedly, and all of the rest of the world. There's way too much that they have to try to cram into one time frame. And it literally doesn't occur to them to do that. So not only are they making a screw up when it comes to the radiometric dating, but they're also making a screw up as to working out what their actual model is, as to how much of Australopithecines are taking place before October 3rd, 2350 BC. And was that the time the rain started falling in the flood or not? We don't ever get that far. Brian says they finally decided the creationists are better than flurfers. At least they semi-agreed on a single model type. I won't go that far, Brian. That you do have a generic model that most young Earth creationists are of the view that the flood was taking place around 2350 BC, and that there had been some rearrangement of the landscape after the creation of 4000 BC-ish, and that there would be more rearrangement of the landscape post-flood, really lickety-split, and then at some point, the critters that we're all familiar with have come about by some process of super duper fast speciation. That's kind of the generic paradigm you get at the arc encounter level that Cy Strike is well aware of, the Answers in Genesis level, the ICR level. Circulate down into grassroots creationism, though. Drag in the Carl Baas and the Kent Hovians, and they're way more unclear about what it is they think happened. And clearly very, 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 very vague when it comes to the detailed chronology of things. Because technically speaking, everything, you should be able to put it on a timeline. And your model should be so precise that you would be able to say, okay, if we go to a particular deposit in a particular space that you would say that's taking place prior to the main flood, that's part of the creation rocks, and then you can see the signs of the flood deposit in there, and so ooh, you don't tend to get that much detail. And that's true even for Andrew Snelling and Woodmarap and Ord and Tim Clary and Kurt Wise, which we'll be alluding to in subsequent episodes. I was going to bring some stuff about Kurt Wise and his creationism video that's been trotting around, but I'm going to leave that to a couple weeks down the road because something came up that was much more exciting, and I'll get to that in the halftime show. But that source methods issue is reminding everybody that one of the core issues is, what do you think happened? And I hope I've been showing that I'm pretty clear about what I think happened in regards to human evolution and animal evolution in general and the history of the solar system and anything you want to deal with. I'm a chronology guy. I want to figure out, okay, this happened, then this happened, and then this happened, and here's how we know that, because we've got this evidence and so forth and so on. And whenever you find people who have what ought to be a model, but when it gets to push and shove, they don't really know what they think happened, that's a dead giveaway. You got a problem. And that's one why source methods would be asking people questions about that. If you, and I've done this with Standing for Truth and others, when you ask them, Jackson Weed has done the same thing, where you'll ask Nephilim free, well, what do you think happened here? What's your explanation for this data, which is connected to that data, but you haven't thought about that because it's not in your apologetics that you've been copying? That's when the train derails, because they can't deal with a new thing. To delay in this feed. So what did I miss? I will recap the last 10 minutes or so. I've been pointing out how the creationist flood geology model, which the Contested Bones authors explicitly believe in, but don't detail in detail, have a model that they want to be true for the evolution of, or the non-evolution of human beings. In their model, human beings were created in Eden, that all extant human beings are descended from the Noah and the kids that were surviving on the ark only 4,500 years ago, that somehow or other a bunch of animals died in the flood, and then later on there was the critters that were on the ark turned into all the forms that we see today. And don't ask us too many questions about that because we haven't worked any of that out. And that's basically where it stands. And that's the fun part, is to see how that maps up with the existing biological and genetic data. Vesta says the YEC young Earth creationists tend not to be as crazy as fluorophers. However, if the climate deniers and anti-vaxxers are the dangerous ones, there's an interesting overlap on that issue, Vesta. Methodologically, they're interchangeable. That's the whole issue of source methods, that every one of them, whether they're an anti-vaxxer or a flat earther or a climate denier, they're relying on very limited data set of people who ignore most of the data for them. They don't fact check. They don't really think through what they think happened, and they don't have standards for changing their mind. You'll notice that those four core elements aren't content related. They're methods related. And there is an overlap in some of your fields. Anti-vaxxers will tend not to be young Earth creationists or flat Earth, or they may or may not be climate science deniers. You can find, I think Robert Kennedy Jr. Is an anti-vaxxer. SciStrike did one of his videos where we were raking him over the coals, and he was showing exactly the same traits. Demographically, he's going to be much more progressive liberal than you would find if you were talking to a flat earther or a climate denier. Now, climate science denialism is a subset of the hyper-conservative worldview, and that overlaps in creationism. So if you encounter an anti-evolutionist, odds are they're a climate science denialist. And if you looked at the polling data, which generally run skepticism about climate science can oscillate around the 50% range-ish, depending upon who's asking the question and how hot the summer happens to be. If you remember that upwards of 40% of the American population are also young Earth creationists, then you can see that a huge chunk of that climate science denialism are just that hyper conservative creationist worldview plus a bit of outliers. Now, then there's the cultural overlap, because you've got things like the Heartland Institute that's fossil fuel funded, that is the frontispiece for that. If you look at, say, how, gosh, the Heritage Foundation, their interactions with climate science denialism, they'll be flirting with the business end of climate science denialism. They won't be really focusing on the stuff that's coming from the young earth creationist angle. So but the cultural demographic is still there. Now, flat flurfers, I love the little flurfer word, flat earthers, they're normally most all a subset of geocentric young earth creationists, anti-evolutionists. And they will likely be much the same cultural tropes that you would find among general creationism. So they will be politically extremely conservative. They probably voted for Donald Trump. They're probably climate denialists. There are one or two, you will find occasional outliers and exceptions to this, but it's extremely unusual. Vesta, perhaps we should put certain individuals on Douglas Adams's B arc. Yes, along with the phone sanitizers. Oh yes, indeed. We want to make sure we deal with them. and the ones who want to figure out what color the wheel is supposed to be. So I'm really keen on reminding everybody about the methods angle here, in addition to content. That if you look at the Tortugan mindset, content is almost peripheral. It's the object of desire. It's the thing that motivates them to believe what they do, and it's viscerally important to them. But from a methods point of view, it's just the paint, the veneer on the structure. It's that underlying mindset of a mind that can effortlessly read a secondary source and it becomes true for them. Well, think about what religion tends to do. They're reading a secondary source, they assume it's true. Oop, the same methodology. So that there are a lot of Tortugans in the religious community. There are a lot of Tortugans in any viewpoint that is dependent upon ideology for its driver. Which gets us to a case example, some case examples of real live wackaloonery. We're coming along towards the middle part of the hour, and so don't launch the shameless plug or anything of that type yet. We still got a few more minutes before, but I'll start introducing the other half of the thing, which is creationists who grasp at straws to try to link real science up with a mythology. And so there is the Jurassic flood that was just a matter of there was once an inland sea in Australia, and there's an issue about whether or not earlier, this was back in the Cretaceous times, earlier in the Jurassic, there seems to be some indication that there were some marine transgressions. In other words, the things leading up to that much larger seascape that you see in the Cretaceous, where the middle of Australia was underwater, and much the same was taking place with North America, where there was a huge Niobara seaway that for a while ran all the way up into the Arctic Ocean. Part of the reason was because of the way water was distributed. If you have tectonics which are not pushing up land in one area, it's possible for sea levels to rise, not because there's more water, but because the land is being gradually eroded away at the periphery, and so the water can fill up more space. So it depends on how continental margins are working. There's a whole bunch of variables that go on there. There's a huge number of subdisciplines that fiddle around with this. The idea that this Jurassic incursion, which was not instantaneous, it was not catastrophic, somehow supported the flood. What did Noah live 150 million years ago? Is that what they're thinking? So they would just latch on to this as though it helped their argument any. I thought that was pretty stupid. Puffalovagus says, thanks me for reaching out to a man on an island on Twitter. You look this time, made a huge difference. I've been in spaces of personal despair in my life. And the fact that there's people out there that you can reach out to and show that you're not alone on your little island is immensely important. And in this era of social media, there's a lot of twaddle that goes on, and in many respects, I can regard what I'm doing here as a talking head as part of that. But if it also allows people to connect up in ways that gets us through the day, that's not a trivial detail. And you just imagine the 19th century. People would go nuts out in the farmland in the middle of nowhere where the nearest neighbor is 50 miles away. Imagine in the dead of winter, maybe a book to read in their house with very little heat, not knowing what the future is going to bring, no radio, no television, no social media, no instantaneous smartphone communication with your relatives. That was a debilitating world. There was a bleakness that drove many people off the edge. And we tend not to think about that today because we have a social networking that's much more effective when we find out about of things. We can diagnose troubles. We can see warning signs of things. And on the downside, we find out about stuff instantaneously. So axe murderer could run around and run amok back in 1870s Puget Sound, which I read about, by the way, in that period. But you wouldn't find it on the evening news instantaneously. Now you would. So we see what's going on in other places of the world with a facility that can sometimes give us a sense of panic attack when we don't necessarily realize things were just as shitty in the past. It just has happened indivisibly. So there's a little bit about that. Vestas has worked in the oil and gas sector for the most part, and most of them I've encountered are not climate deniers who most agree that CO2 is a major issue. Yeah, and it'd be an interesting issue to see how much of that has to do with the fact that they're not going to be intersecting with that creationist worldview. You don't make money in the fossil fuel industry by believing in flood geology. Quite to the contrary, it's a flush your money down the toilet if you try to use other than standard geology. So there is a direct bifurcation between people who have a training in that area. It's no coincidence, I think, that Steve Meyer, who's an intelligent design advocate, is not a young earth creationist. Why? Because he worked in the oil industry. And so he knows about the visceral facts where he realizes, nah, I can't buy into that young earth creationism thing. It won't work. Well, we are now in the midpoint, so what we will put up, Cy can put up the shameless plug, and so when I see his microphone muting, I will know that he's putting up the thank the Patreons, which I would oh, yikes, I should normally be reading that. That's the one thing we forgot about. I will just have to riff off of the fact that we have been very lucky and, dare I say, secular blessed from the wonderful people who have supported the project and who have actually ponied up money through the Patreon. And I normally would be reading all of those names off. Cy Strike, at the moment I see the little mute on there, it means that that the image is up on screen. And hopefully in the next bit, I don't want to have to open up my word processor and all that again, and to read the thing. So we have various levels of people who have helped from the top to the bottom, and some of them who are right in here in this room who have helped the project. And I am extremely thankful to every single one of you. And the more who can help out, the easier it is to get by one day at a time. And I appreciate every single one of you. There also will be the linkage page that hopefully it will be putting up, which gives the links to the GoFundMe and also to the Patreon and to my website. And all the material up at tortuganwordpress.com. It's freebie. Download it, make use of it, share it right and left. That's all what it amounts to. That I know how amazing it is to be able to go from person working in his den to doing YouTubes like this, and to have books out, and to have people that are all over the planet who are familiar with what I'm doing and helping to spread the word on that. That's an amazing phenomenon. And hopefully more and more people will be involved in it. Other people will be joining the parade in their own ways. People like Pelagia and Jackson Wheat that I'm co-authoring works with are people who have been doing the source methods approach on their own, and I've kind of just upped the ante a bit. B Sharp says, creationists will always post hoc rationalize the evidence to fit their conclusions. It's like pinning unset jelly to a Bible or jello to a wall, as the saying goes. And Brian Stevens says, wait, you mean petrology and floodology aren't the same field? My. we live in a wonderful time for the science. And I know firsthand how spectacularly vivid the technical literature is in many, many, many ways that you can gain access to without paying a dime. And so what I urge everybody to do if they have an interest, to be able to follow it up and join the campaign of presenting reason in whatever venues you want, and connect up with other people so that between our whole network, we can gain access to just about everything. So I learn constantly from working with Jackson Wheat. I learn constantly new material that comes up from the technical literature that I see from people I follow on Twitter, the scientists. And you can also fabulously do research based upon the stuff that you can read creationists doing. So the material that I put up about that Jurassic flood, there's also some material from a video lecture by David Woodward, who is, I think Woodward, on geology. He is a standard geological historian. He does not believe in the global flood, and it's a delicious lecture. It's about a little over an hour long, wonderful. And there was an online Twitter creationist who insisted this lecture somehow debunked all the arguments against the flood. Well, that piqued my curiosity. And for one thing, it turned out the guy had not even actually seen the lecture. He apparently only heard about it. And then when we finally dragged him kicking and screaming to actually, I Googled the material and plopped it on his lap. At that point, he decided to actually watch it. And then he just dug in his heels. Anybody who follows me on Twitter would find about, I went back and forth on the thing that people ought to know by now that if you're going to recommend a video that I watch, I'm going to watch it and I'm going to comment on it. And if it's a reasonable or a stupid one, I'm going to say so one way or the other. Well, Woodward's video was actually marvelous. There was nothing in it that was inaccurate. In fact, he was tracking exactly the same argument that I did on the flood, which is that there are aspects of both the Sumerian flood legends and even maybe the Black Sea flooding that contributed to the stories that eventually got funneled in with the biblical tale. But the main arguments that somehow or other stratigraphy and the superimposition idea that Nicholas Steno came up with in the 17th century, that in a deposit, that the stuff on the bottom is going to be older than the stuff on the top. Duh, that's the way stuff forms. That none of that's been refuted, and yet this idiot actually thought this video completely undermined it. I put a quote up from the fellow as to what he was claiming about the video. And I urge everybody to actually watch the video. First of all, you'll learn a hell of a lot of fun stuff. And you'll learn about the history and how the geology shifted. Ironically, how Louis Agassiz, who is no friend of evolution, he was the guy that came up with the ice ages, or ice age, just one at the time. Later on, they discovered, of course, there were lots of them, and he could never quite wrap his brain around the idea that there was more than one ice age. But the point is, it knocked the props out from under the last vestige of physical support for the global flood model. And so it's by the time you hit the mid-19th century, the time that Darwin's evolution theory is hitting in, any remnants of the idea that the biblical flood was going to explain much of anything in the geologic column was just dead as a doornail, quite independent of evolution. And yet, too many creationists don't seem to know that. And this poor creationist who was trying to trot out this lecture couldn't manage it either. So let me see what's going on in the live feed in here. By trying to connect up the source methods with what I do talks on and what other people deal with, I hope everybody gets the bug on this one. It's that what you want to have is a proper analysis of primary sources. And everybody in the argument is going to have a particular area of interest that they want to look into and follow it up. Creationists are gold mines for information without them realizing it. If there's one thing that's been really clear from my interacting with anti-evolutionists, is that when they bring up a science paper, it's probably a thing they shouldn't do. and that you actually learn stuff. And by reading the sources they bring up and then reading beyond them, especially if they're old ones, you get ahead of them. And that means that you're much more confident the next time you bump into that sort of thing. Immutable Destiny says, when did the whole lunar Bubaki theory develop? Nephilim surely isn't dumb enough to make that up. I think that refers to these bubbling things for craters, something like that. Somebody can correct me on whether or not I've been misunderstanding the elements of it. Creationists, for some unusual reason, have a problem figuring out why the moon is the way it is. And the unusual reason may be because their model's wrong. So, oh my gosh, yes, 5:30. I jumped the gun on you. Sorry, 10 minutes ago on that. If I see you go mute again, it'll be because you're putting up the Patreon account screen again, or for the first time. I apologize for the semi confusion of the circumstance here, because we're running through Zoom platform this time, and trying to figure out how to get the bandwidth structured so that you can actually see my talking head and the words match up nicely. Oh, water hitting the moon. Oh, tornado in a junkyard. Thank you. Water hitting the moon. Oy vey. Yeah. Yeah, the flood waters of these unbelievable spurts would have been sloshing onto the moon. No, sorry. The real science has no problem with water in the universe. Hydrogen is the first atom to be made, and all of the universe consists primarily of hydrogen to this very day. Hydrogen, pesky little thing, has the ability to form chemical bonds. And once you start forming oxygen and having them spewed out because of the formation of heavier elements in supernovas, gosh, molecules form. Duh, hydrogen and oxygen form. So water is actually surprisingly abundant in the universe. In fact, one of the shows that was just on Nova last week on Saturn and the rings, it's looking extremely likely that Saturn's rings are relatively recent, as in a few 100,000 years. And so that if you had gone back and looked at Saturn through a telescope 100 million years ago, you wouldn't have seen a ring system there on that scale. All the gas giants tend to collect rings. There's very faint rings on all the gas giants, but Saturn is the spectacular one. And it's apparently because an icy moon of the right form just happened to get caught in its Roche limit and bloop, got pulled apart. And so it's a temporary and spectacular feature, in the same way that it's highly likely that the Jupiter's red spot isn't permanent. We know it's been around for a few centuries because Galileo was seeing it through his early telescopes, but there's no reason to suspect that it was around 1 million years ago or 100 million years ago. And so things are more dynamic than that. But water then is not something that's difficult to account for. Liquid water is a rarer thing because not every space is thermally conducive to that. And that's what makes our planet a nice place to live on, because water is liquid here and it isn't in other places, or it's frozen on Mars. And that's the way it goes. So the notion that flood water was splashing the moon is not the weirdest things that have been proposed about the moon. My favorite is back from Henry Morris in the 1970s, when he was arguing that in the battle between Archangel Michael and Satan, that thunderbolts were thrown around, and that's what made the craters on the moon. I think that tops the floodwaters sloshing the moon theory by quite a wide margin. Let's see. Yes, Tornado and Junkyard says, I know why the moon is the way it is. It's called asteroids. Yeah, the late heavy bombardment, if anybody is curious about that, they can just Google this. When I was a young whippersnapper, back in the 1950s and 60s, none of this was known. And so that's another reason why we should be amazed at the scientific advancements that have gone on, to where if we have an advantage with a lot of better modeling. We have far more sophisticated computers that can handle umpteen little particles. And so it began to dawn on them that they could think more about what it means for things to accrete into planetesimals. And it's not just occurring in simple lumps, it's all over the place. And so you have a period in the early solar system that's just all hell breaks loose, because you've got lots and lots and lots of little planetoids popping along. And in fact, the reason why we have such a gigantic moon is because an extremely large Mars-sized thing splatted into the Earth, threw off a massive material, vaporized the Mars planetesimal, and generated stuff that's formed from the upper crust of the already forming Earth, which is why the features of the rocks that were brought back by the Apollo missions showed the constituents of lunar rock to be very distinctive and inexplicable except by this impact model. So that the old models of simultaneous accretion or nebular formation or captured satellite, neither one of those fit what the facts were as to the odd isotope concentration, particular amounts of oxygen and all of that. And you can check up on that. Brian Stephen, C. Brown says on a biological subject, the FRG1 gene, have you finally figured out what evolutionary processes involve this gene that has programmed the entire? C. Brown, you're a creationist doofus. You brought this subject up before. You seem to misunderstand what that gene is about. I suggest you write your monograph up and submit it to the science journal or the scientist in question. Contact the scientist who wrote the paper and tell them what you think is involved here and let us know on that. So bye, C. Let's see, Tornado Junkyard says asteroids in that pesky little force called insert desert file here. Yeah, gravity, effing gravity. Yeah, and not only a little bit of that, you've also got electromagnetism going on, and then also the dynamics of solar wind and there's a lot of variables that have to be added into all of this stuff that modern cosmology deals with. That stuff that when I was growing up in the 1950s, they didn't either appreciate or have the technical modeling to be able to work out. But it's not 1950, it's 2019. So C. Brown and the other creationists who might be following in this area, do your homework, research this material, find out what things are actually about, work out what your model is. If you want to come up with a young Earth creationist explanation for stuff, do it. But explain all the data. You haven't accounted for the therapsids. You can't explain why ALUs are the way they are, and you can't even deal with why the hell there's an FRFG1 gene and how it connects up with all the other genes in its gene family. So there we go. Brian Stevens says C. Brown is just dense, like a singularity type dense. Yeah. That if too many C. Browns gather in a tight space, it can actually form a little teeny mini black hole. And that would be the end of that. And that's what happens in a lot of political parties today. There's far too many C. Browns that come together and they end up becoming heads of nations, and to the despair of all. So Tornado says, yeah, C. Brown is a young Earth creationist. Yeah, and a credulous one. If you look back in a lot of my videos, he's popped up in a lot of commentary things. I had him on the show once and he just couldn't answer a straight question. He wanted to just Nephilimize everything and just blaster on about his stuff. And so I said, bye, you're out of here. So he comments every so often and basically repeats the stuff that he reads in the anti-evolution literature. It's very, very dreary and boring. C cannot by any stretch of the imagination profess to be a fact claimant. At best, he is a bottom-feeding secondary creationist who reads a limited amount of creationism stuff. He isn't as fast on the draw in terms of our articulateness as, say, Standing for Truth is, but they're operating at exactly the same level. And excuse me if Sanford and Jeffrey Tompkins and these other actual people with genetic degrees can't make their valid case. I'm not going to hold my breath for C. Brown to do that. You know, he's a typical active attention seeker, and he can go do videos if he wishes. He can comment on whatever he likes, but the world of science ain't going to slow down for you in the same way that I don't expect the world of science to stop for me. It isn't based on either C. Brown or me or Cy Strike or anybody else. The science goes on and does their thing. The scientists do their work. And the difference is that C. Brown is trawling for information that supposedly affirms a model that he can't articulate and work out. I'm trying to understand all the science about the model that's already been worked out, which is the full modern 21st century science of paleontology and genetics and developmental biology and cosmology and astrophysics and all of that. And I'm like a kid in a candy store. I'm delighted by that. Brian says, C. Brown has been spewing stupid stuff for years on the web. G Plus Wiki has an entry on him. Oh, isn't that sweet? Yes, he's made the hall of shame in that respect. And so nobody has an excuse for stupid in 2019. People will be stupid. That Twitter creationist who was completely misrepresenting that lecture video is a perfectly fine example of it. But that doesn't mean that the rest of us have to be stupid on their behalf. So make use of the material. I've mentioned before, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is a go-to thing, because unlike Science and Nature, where you can still get a lot of the stuff freebie either there or on other websites, PNAS, that's a National Academy of Sciences thing. And everything in there is freebie after 1 year, and a big chunk of it is open access even from the get-go. And so you can get good tabs on an awful lot of science topics just by stopping in there every week and seeing what the new papers are. You don't have to read everything. You don't have to download anything or everything, but you can get a good feel for where the science is going and whatever particular area fascinates you. There's not a huge amount on geology in it, but there's a huge amount on all aspects of developmental biology and genetics. You get some paleontology material and occasional astrophysics stuff. You get quite a good amount on climatology and cognitive science and other kinds of things. So it's a different mix, but it's something to look at. Oh, C. Brown, let me speak on your show, James. Let's keep you. I wouldn't let me, no, I would let you speak. It's just as I wanted to discuss your source methods. You don't want to discuss your source methods. You don't want to tell about whether you ever fact check a damn thing. And so you can spew your arguments, and you do spew your arguments repetitively, boringly, monotonously as comments on the videos. And I have never deleted you, fine and dandy. You can go ahead and do that. But I would not want to inflict upon the audience. They do that in SciStrike's show of watching incredibly stupid things. I wouldn't want to inflict that upon my audience, where we have more important things to do than to deal with your ego. So there we go. And Tornado says, points out to C. Brown, a genome is different from a gene. A gene makes up part of a genome, but is not responsible for it. And Lisa for Truth asks C. Brown, why don't you explain why we have turned off monkey genes? Yeah, and turned on monkey genes too. Everything down to our biology. My favorite bit is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is, I hope I'm spelling this correctly, cingulate cortex. This is the little brain system that's in a primate social conflict resolution system that activates in the primates. They don't have articulate language, we do. And we've also modified and co-opted it for a different purpose, which is self-deception. It lights up like a Christmas tree during self-deception. So some of the reasons why I'm sure C. Brown's anterior cingulate cortex has been a buzzing is because of the brain systems that we inherited from our primate ancestry. Live with it, go with it, do something about it, or ignore it as you will. It doesn't change any of the data field. So anyway, 5:43, let's see what's going on now. Heat Shield says, C. Brown, with all due respect, why don't you email him or tag him in his chat directly instead of repeating, let me on your show? Oh, he contacts and puts up, I interact with him a lot when he puts up messages on my YouTubes. That's been the case. The thing is that I keep on saying, why are you wasting your fabulous, incredible genius on me? I'm just a bloody little YouTuber with a few hundred views each week. Why don't you go and tell the scientists that they're wrong? By all means, write email. You can email them. They have email addresses. Read their abstracts in the technical journals. You'll find that there's a lead author that typically has an email, and often many of the co-authors put their email address up. Contact them. Tell them why you, C. Brown, know their discipline way better than they do, that you, lacking a PhD, has absolute superior knowledge in this area because you managed to read creationist literature that told you what you want to be true, and explain to them why they're wrong. Go ahead, Have fun with that. You don't need me for that. You don't need to interact with me on that. Go after the heavy guns in this area, and do please report. I repeatedly asked C. Brown to contact us as to his reaction and what answers he gets from the scientists when he tells them that he knows their disciplines better than they do. And so there it is. That always beware of somebody operating at the wrong field. When I did a video a ways back, now a long ways back, where I was dealing with Andrew Snelling's misrepresentation of diamonds. I was, I don't think I'm not sure I did a video on it, but I have alluded to it. And I mentioned to it, and I think I've even brought it up with Standing for Truth and C. Brown over the years, as they brought up that the diamonds are not a creationist best friend. The notion is that somehow or other there's way too much carbon in diamonds if they're billions of years old. And the problem is that they cited a particular paper by Southron that was on calibrating radiocarbon dating instruments using diamonds precisely because they're extremely old and have very little remnant carbon in them for reasons that have been explained, but not zero. A little smidgies, because cosmic rays can turn a carbon-13 atom into a carbon-14 and all that stuff. Carbon-12 into carbon-14, just naturally. And they show up exactly what you would expect. A remnant value that if you plug it into the formulas, you get 80 and 90,000 years for the diamond, which is off the scope, basically. Well, to make sure that I knew what was going on, and also I needed the full paper to be able to check up on all this stuff, I emailed the author of the paper, and he very kindly sent me the paper. You'll find that an awful lot of scientists will in fact do that. So they're anxious to further their understanding of things and be happy to defend stuff, and that's what happens in the real sciences. Whereas in creationism, it's a shell game. Brian Stevens says this is a gene I think he's referring to, and people can follow up on that linkage. C. Brown, James, am I a coward? You told me you were going to do a show about this gene, then you disappeared. I've mentioned the gene more than once. I've commented on the damn thing. And if anybody want it, the gene is part of a gene family. All genes are parts of gene families, and there's an evolutionary history on it. And so once again, forget me. I am just lowly little R.J. Downard talking from my little den in Spokane. Why are you wasting your fabulous, incredible genius time on little old me? I am but a nobody, a fluff in the wind. Go after the scientists in general. Tell them why you know their field better. The one who is a coward here is you. You're not willing to tell them to their face that they're wrong, but that's functionally what you're doing. You're telling them they don't understand their own work. They don't understand the implications of their material, that you know that way better. Why? Because you've read Rupe and Sanford and a couple pieces by Andrew Snelling. Oh, piffle sticks. So anyway, back to the matter of the sciences on all of that. Even C. Brown is a perfectly fine instance of how you can deal with these matters at source level. You can ask for sources, and when I would ask C. Brown for sources, he would often be very evasive. Sometimes he would finally drag up stuff, and then I could look up in my reference base. One of the things I do in my TIP project is track what anti-evolutionists cite for technical literature. And so I can find that if it's got a little black mark against it, boop, that means that paper has been cited by anti-evolutionists. And so you can sometimes track down where they're getting their secondary material from. I found that as a general principle, if a creationist like C. Brown insists that there's something wildly anti-evolutionary and designy about a gene, research the bloody thing and find out about it, and go and proceed on into that. And Psystrike says the profound piffle sticks. Yes, and there's also mega piffle for if you need to up the ante to a higher level of piffle. You occasionally get that well, you get that a lot with flat earthers, or that video that was just on last week on Psystrike's channel, which was just exceeding the boundary layers of rational inquiry. Once in a while, you find somebody that starts shooting up into 3 and 4 on the Jeranism index. And it's not easy to do that, but you get that. Some of the extreme wacky is made up on the fly. You'll find in Psystrike, you'll probably see that as well. In a lot of these things, it's made up improvisationally, where they scavenge a little piece of twaddle here and a bits of something there and assemble something. They're the smorgasborders. And in the grassroots anti-evolutionism department, smorgasborders are way more common. Typically, if somebody is anal retentive enough to kind of try to get their ducks in a row in terms of citations, they'll probably now go and do YouTubes. And so there'll be the Standing for Truth types who will do the videos where they will then purvey the stuff they have gleaned secondarily. And all of that can be useful inquiry as to working out what's going on. Brian Stevens says his grandfather used piffle a lot when the kids would say things she doubted. Yes, it's an old word that has been handed down in my family for years, and it's a nice word, piffle. And we get an awful lot of that this time. And I think that if anybody spouts piffle, that it's the duty of non-piffleists to come up and say so. And research the piffle, find out, is it new piffle or is it vintage piffle? If it's vintage piffle, in my area, because I study the creation evolution issue at some depth, you can often spot where people are getting their piffle from in that venue because it's not new piffle. And then occasionally you'll find people who invent new wrinkles on that. The little block of somewhat and Seventh-day Adventist homeschoolers, it apparently is, who like the idea that dinosaurs are just made up, that they didn't exist at all. Well, that's piffle. It's also not standard creationist piffle. It's a grassroots lore piffle that will gradually percolate up into the field and may never actually settle in at the mid-range of creationist apologetics. Let's see. Lisa for Truth says anti-evolutionists can read. Oh, many of them are very good readers and very good scrupulous copyists. Make use of that fact, Lisa, because sometimes the exact wording of things can track down where stuff goes. That's what, when I did my debate with Kent Hovind, and you'll, if you haven't seen my debate with Kent Hovind, see my debate with Kent Hovind, and let everyone else know about it as well. But one of the main things I picked up was that he had copied a huge swath of his argument directly from Harun Yahya, the Turkish creationist. And I could do that because I was copying down line by line certain key phrases that struck me as the sort of thing that he was either riffing off an original paper or somebody he was copying from, and that's what it turned out to be. Tornado in a junkyard. He caught a flat earther and a lie about Polaris, and they called me a, quote, paid slave, unquote, because of it. Showed them why they were wrong, and since then, crickets. Oh, yeah. Yeah. If only I were getting my Joe Soros checks as a paid shill. Or I'm sure SciStrike and I both really would like to be on the NASA paid shill list so that we could get some extra scratch that way. But in lieu of that, my Patreon is available, and SciStrike has his Patreon, and anyone else in that department, Tornado and others, each have their own ways of helping out. A buck, $5, whatever, if you can spare a little bit on a regular basis, every bit of that adds up, as I know, each month. So O'Brien says trying to work on the turbulence problem vis-a-vis the Navier-Stolz equations, but not making any headway through stuff. Tough stuff. You're just above my pay grade. The wonderful thing about modern science is that you've got, at the people doing the work level, whether it's geology and astrophysics and the other areas, is that so many new tools are available. And that's what amazes me about all that. When you look at C. Brown's shrunken homunculus of creationism, that's basically riffing off of ideas that were formulated in the 1970s that were in turn riffing off of Seventh-day Adventist theology from 1910. That it's a threadbare nothing. It doesn't have the ring of truth about it. Whereas you move over to the real science, and wow, this is neat, and it's pregnant with extrapolations to where people can follow through and investigate new things, and one thing leads to another, and yet more understanding comes. And that's the difference between science and pseudoscience. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Before we're getting near to the end of the hour, I want to recap that Jackson Wheat, by the way, is currently at his job and therefore could not join us for our hangout here, but he is always a welcome character here. He and I are writing a new book, The Rocks Were There, which is going to be hopefully done by the end of the year, so we can have that as your must-have Christmas present or gift to the creationist that you really don't like. And although I would think my knowledge and information is far too interesting to waste on a creationist, so I think you probably want to give it to somebody who can actually benefit from that. Anyway, The Rocks Were There is a full court press takedown on the Answers in Genesis books and the attendant arguments, because an awful lot of this bumps into intelligent design on a lot of the genetics and biological era. And if you liked the Rocks, my Evolution Slam Dunk book, its Rocks Were There is going to be squared, cubed better. It's even more cutting edge material, even more broadly ranged. I'm absolutely delighted with what Jackson and I have been coming up with text for this. It's going to be a kick butt, and even more kick butty than Slam Dunk. And if you haven't gotten Evolution Slam Dunk, what's a wasting? It's out there at Amazon.com and in ebooks formats, which is the book on the reptile mammal transition, and you will know all about everything you would ever need to know to combat anybody on that, plus a whole bunch of other subject matter. I mean, I've got a hell of a lot of references on that. And of course, there's also my novel, the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. I'm slogging away on the sequel of that. There's going to be about 10 more novels in that series. So, and Jackson Wheat and I, after the Rocks Were There book in 2020-ish, we'll be doing a book on atheism and the history and nature of religion. So that's going to be a delightful subject matter that our brains are already kind of tracking in that area, and I'm starting to assemble material on that. And TD Lane says they're planning on getting Evolution Slam Dunk when I have some money. As somebody who is a scrape by 1 month at a time person, I'm well appreciative of that. Even some of the works that, for example, the reason why I've got this book, which is The Creationist Origins Linking Science and Scripture, is because Jackson got the copy for me. And so we could make use of that for the new book. And so, for a college kid, good gravy. I mean, that's to scrape money to help an old fart help on a project like this is something that I enormously appreciate. And because Jackson understands, as I do, that seeing the original source material, we went into this one because this one makes them just head up their ass stupid claims about coral growth. And it required tracking down a massive primary source material, which it turns out the author of the book got completely wrong. And I know this will come as a shock. A creationist gets primary source data incorrect, but I know these things do happen. So we're just about down to the end of the hour. When I see Cy Strike put his mute up there, and then we'll know the shameless plug part 2 has been put up, where we will be showing the links to the GoFundMe.com DCGo, and also to the Patreon RJ Downard, where anybody can help out the project to which they may, and of course my main website, the www.tortucan.wordpress.com, which I will put in the thing here. And you'll find links directly to all the books in all the different print and ebook formats there as well. That's what I try to have that on there. It's a very rudimentary thing. I'm still new at all of this website-y stuff, and I'm busy working on all of the projects and keeping all the little balls in the air. And thanks to people like Cy Strike, who have been able to help out after the panic attack as Google Hangouts became irrelevant for YouTube. We get by with a little help from our friends, as the old Beatletoons puts it. So there we go. I think we are at the end of the hour. And if Cy Strike puts up the shameless plug to see us out, and that will pretty much do that. C. Brown, well, we're waiting for that. C. Brown says, James, I'm merely trying to understand what evolutionary mechanisms can give rise to a protein that can program the entire genome during early embryonic development. Sorry, we've been around that already in the discussions, and it's all the same shtick. So at this point, once we are done, Cy can curtail the video, and at which point he may tell me that we are now off the air. So until then, I will continue to jibber jabber. Any creationist that anybody engages, I try to be polite with, but at the same time, I'm not here as a way of just engaging in endless ping pong. And if you want to come up with a model for what you think the genes are doing, you want to deal with the available data field, fine, Danny, go ahead, do that, C. Brown. Stop bothering about me. I'm not a geneticist. Why don't you go after the geneticists? Don't they know more than I do? The authors of the paper presumably do. So proceed with that. And there we go.
RJ, would you like to wrap it up with your opening as a closing?
Oh, yes, you can put that, whatever you want to put. Yes, go on with it.
Very good.
Yes. Now, bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.